Great, thanks everyone for coming. This is the final show and tell for the Waste Exemptions Alpha project that we've been working on. We're going to go through things we found and some recommendations from our project. So where it began, I can't begin to knowing. Sweet Caroline, just a little joke there. It began with a hazardous waste discovery that had this as a recommendation at the end of it, to investigate and prototype ideas for the exemptions process, which kind of led on from some things we found in hazardous waste discovery, some around waste exemption being ideal for change, and also around helping being a great further exemplar for agile working in NRW. Our approach to this, this was our kind of timeline here. We started back at the beginning of April. It's now the end of July. We had 7 proper sprints and then a kind of pre-discovery sprint, and we've got 3 days this week to wrap up. So tomorrow's our last day. We've been doing lots of user research, both with internal and external participants. We've done some idea generation prototypes, which we then tested with users. And this is us doing our final synthesis and our final recommendations. Yeah, so we external user interviews, internal generation workshops. So we did some data analysis as well and looked at analytics from the website. Yes, that's what we've been looking at. Our scope has changed somewhat over the project. So we started out like this. We had a kickoff session with our SMEs, and we kind of looked at the whole waste process end to end, and took a sliver of it, sliver of it, which is this thing on the left that you can see. It's kind of based on some of our key learnings from discovery, and what was in scope here was how users explore and understand and select which waste exemption activities that they need to register, or regulatory decisions they need to follow. And we kept out of scope pretty much everything else. So permits are out of scope. Anything before this layer or after this layer in the waste service, including the actual act of registering, remained out of scope. After a couple of sprints, we narrowed that down a little bit more. We wrote a new problem statement. We worked with our SMEs to kind of generate some assumptions and assume user needs. And this problem statement led us to focus on the renewal process. So when farmers renew their waste exemption activities, waste exemptions, they select all exemption activities. That was on our central assumptions. And that's a problem because it decreases the likelihood the conditions are read and complied with. So they just go, yeah, I got to register. I'll just take them all because they're free. I won't bother looking at what I need to do. That was the assumption. However, we then iterated on that again in our mid-alpha review, after we found that actually that it wasn't the case that they were just selecting all. There were some cases of that, but actually when we looked into the data and spoke to users, that wasn't what was happening. And instead we altered our assumption slightly to unclear content leads to farmers struggling to understand the exemption activities. This is a problem because it decreased the likelihood that conditions are complied with. So that was our focus from then. We did do some learning and adapting throughout the process. This is absolutely normal in any project. You start with a set of thoughts about how things are going to go. Once you meet reality, things are different. The great thing about agile working is that it's set up with the assumption that you're going to be wrong, you're going to find out new things, and it enables you to alter direction quite quickly and to adapt to things that you learn. So a few things that caused us to have to adapt our approach. Recruiting external user research participants was very, very difficult. Farmers are very, very busy people, particularly at this time of year. And they, I think every single participant we had who was a farmer rescheduled their interview at some point. It took us a while to get any. We had an external recruitment agency working with us, and they really, really struggled as well. It's a very, very tricky thing. We ended up speaking to more people within NRW to compensate for that. Some of our initial assumptions turned to be false, like registering all exemptions. So we changed our direction of focus. I spoke about that. There was more to learn than we realised, and there was more conflict within NNW about what was going on. And by conflict, I mean people having different opinions on how things worked or what the system was or what users thought. So it turned out there was less certainty there. That meant we had to do a bit more research before we felt able to prototype. I will quickly, very, very quickly show the prototypes, if I can. I'll share this. Can you now see this? This is first prototype we did, which is very similar to the guidance that's on gov.uk for the D1 depositing waste from dredging in the waters exemption. And it's functionally the same format, but we kind of looked at the content and cleaned it up, made it much easier to understand, wrote it in more plain English, and changed the format so it was better structured. We also wrote a version in what we hope is plain Welsh, but we'll get onto that in a bit. So broadly the same, much shorter than what's there already, and users did find that it helped with their comprehension and was easier to understand than the existing content. We'll get up the second one, which was quite different. This second one was more of a it's called a decision tree type approach. You might have seen government service like this: asks you a question, you answer yes or no, and it takes you to another, like a flow chart taking you through a journey. So this is around helping people find out if they can register or should register for this exemption. Ask you a series of questions. So will I leave the waste next to the water? Yes, you will. The buttons don't actually work properly, so I have to use this one down here. Will you deposit more than 50 cubic meters? No, I won't. Had a little bit of content there to say how much is 50 cubic meters, because that was something that's very difficult to visualize. Helped when we said it's about a 2-story house. Will you screen the waste? Let's just say yes. And then yes, so it tells you that you can. So once you've gone through that, it's a very quick way of just, can I do this? Can I do this thing? And then takes you on the onward journey to apply for an exemption. So I will come back now to the presentation. Apologies if I am rushing through this somewhat. I'm just conscious that we've got quite a lot to get through. So do stop me if you have questions. I'll try and answer in the chat. But for now, I'm going to pass over to Graham, who's a researcher, who's going to whiz through the findings.
Thanks, Thomas. These are just the top-level findings. My colleagues Adam and Michael will go through some examples of detail after I finish these. We started talking to internal users at NRW and as our starting point, and spoke a lot to them so we could triangulate, and be reasonably sure of our evidence. And it was very clear that they know huge amounts about farmers in Wales, and how they interact with waste legislation. Sometimes this knowledge is incredibly deep and detailed, but it's not connected or coordinated. We found it tends to being diffuse, and perhaps it's a connected thing that the data we looked at, the objectives of data collection or the examples or way it was used were sometimes unclear and patchy. Welsh, very clearly, Welsh speakers aren't able to pursue the whole registration process in Welsh at the moment. There are translation gaps, and the use of technical English among two people who would describe themselves as Welsh first speakers was something we sort of dug into, but it remains a sort of persistent feature of Welsh and English sort of co-presentations of data and guidance. Broad acknowledgement at NRW that users generally, and farmers in particular, need clearer and simpler paths to exemption registration and the website overall than what exists now. But there's less agreement on what that would look like. Some people's hero page was other people's example of the disaster page or interaction on the website. Can I ask you to flip on to the next one, Thomas? Thank you. So what we uncovered were lots of barriers that farmers had in order to, between them and making what we might suppose to be better exemption registrations. Obviously, the weather and crops and livestock have time priority in farming lives, and admin time is always a challenge to carve out. And there's even less time to absorb the complex detail that exists around certainly some of the exemptions. And this renewal every 3 years that happens is obviously somewhat at odds with the day-to-day management, perhaps, of remembering everything you have to do. There are barriers to sort of farmers' engagement. There's no feedback once you've registered. You might find yourself on the register. Some farmers weren't aware that there was a register, even though they had their exemptions. And then adding, having this main episode of exemption registration and then adding them later on seems unintuitive and difficult to farmers who, in any case, might think this is a tick box experience, which reduces their faith in the process overall. There is a sort of history of exemption difficulties. They have been around for some years, but they have changed. Farmers sometimes tell you that anything that happened in their generation is new. The time frame is one of exemption difficulties, and farmers have built help with specialists in their union and in other places who are now permanently between the farmers and the sort of all the information that exists about exemptions. Could nudge on. At the core of all this were barriers that people experience to understanding, and we'll come to some examples a little bit later on. But confusing language and concepts in the process of registration and in the process, we perhaps should say, of gathering guidance. The sheer weight of detail and the amount you have to go through to become aware of what you don't need to do is a heavy burden. Conflicting conceptual models using different words in different places for the same things. And farmers found the gov.uk exemptions content too long and confusing. Our sort of validation, I suppose, of part of this finding came with the testing of the prototypes that Thomas has just shared, and we saw that redesigning content using best practice principles improved user comprehension, and expressing content in a Q&A or the decision tree format seemed to reduce cognitive load. Cognitive load was at the center of our analysis on whether something was easy to understand and produce actions from. Content that is you can remember when you get to the end of the page what you're doing. It doesn't conflict with your short-term memory. It means something to the specifics that you're looking for, and it lets you ignore what you don't need to be aware of. There were drivers out there as well. The custom hub, the area teams and the field networks do huge amounts of work, and people obviously, some people have a preference for speaking to people and it reassures them, but sometimes the process might not work if they weren't able to help, we surmised. Consultants and the unions are compliance-oriented guides to the process, and they prompt users and improve their behavior in compliance around exemptions. Assurance schemes drive the detail in compliance about exemptions and other things, and they provide a more regular deadlines and prompts for farmers to think about in terms of what they're exempt from. We did think that the low consequences of inaccurate registration, farmers probably won't come to any harm if they do something less than 100% perfect in their registration, since it is a kind of low risk form of legislation and compliance. And that should drive adoption, but we didn't find evidence of it. And we started out thinking farmers whose average age over 60 are kind of anti-digital and don't really want anything to do with it. It's not like the rest of farming. But we uncovered lots of different things. People using YouTube to learn complex concepts around regenerative agriculture from experts all over the world, wishes and demands for more sophisticated data input systems and intelligent maps for soil temperature, water levels, and everything else to give real live information. These are things farmers are asking for. Remote farmers rely increasingly on connectivity and come to expect it, bandwidth permitting, and there's a rich culture developing around that, and certainly fluency. And some farmers have a sort of dim view of the slightly poor IT systems, as they put it, of that are in place at NRW. Because obviously, if you do use if you are a reasonably competent digital user, you compare what works generally with what works less well. And there were situations in which NRW was found wanting by users, by farmers. And the last thing sort of perhaps to remember is that perhaps it's too strong to say farmers know best. It's only meant to grab your attention, but they see themselves as stewards of the land and ultimate guardians of the quality of the produce that they sell. Somebody said they don't want to poison half of Birmingham with their milk, and they never would. Why all the regulations that ensure that are in place, they're less sure about. But they sometimes think that their care adds up to automatically environmental benefit for everybody. And then there is also a sort of active, instinctive dislike for administrators telling real fifth generation farmers how they should be farming. And that's part of the kind of cultural barrier, I suppose, that comes into this area of compliance and legislation. I think that's it now. I'm going to hand over, I think, to Adam, who's going to go into a little bit more detail about one aspect of the findings. Adam, if I got that right.
That's right. Thanks, Graham. Hopefully my camera's working. So early on in the project, as we were talking to internal NRW staff and our SMEs, we wanted to gain a broad understanding of what the exemption, waste exemption service is, where its boundaries are. So the sort of things you would expect to see are a part of this, the exemption content on NRW, as well as the specific exemption activity content, which sits on gov.uk and is owned by the Environmental Agency. There is a portal for registering and renewing all exemptions, excluding T11s and 3 that don't need to be registered. But what we also found was that because exemptions sat in this hierarchy with permits, and also we did explore regulatory decisions and discovered another thing called low risk positions, which are very similar to regulatory decisions. It's quite a burden for users to figure out where they sit, where their activity sits. And so they reach out for supporting services such as the customer hub. They use the pre-application advice service, which is primarily set up to gain advice for permits. However, people do use it to ask questions about their activities that end up being exemptions. They contact the area teams directly if they know them from previous encounters, or a friend of a friend knows a number. One area team leader says that sometimes his actual work number gets passed on, so they'll contact them directly to ask questions. So moving on to the next slide. The things that we found about the journey is that the exemption registration journey is confusing because of this multiple routes that are being split up. One for temporary storage exemptions, one for which ends up in them not needing to register, T11 exemptions that leads them to register via its own form and a payment system, and then the rest that sit in the portal. NRW's website does not offer help for users looking to check if their site is near a watercourse, a site of scientific interest, or other relevant sites or landmarks that impact or affect the sort of activity they plan to do, or the regulatory option they decide to go with. This is mentioned in the exemption content on NRW, that they need to be aware of this, but there is no direct way to find out if they are, and what that impact is if it turns out that they are close to one of these things. There is low awareness internally and externally for regulatory decisions and low risk positions. So externally, with the farmers, this wasn't necessarily something that we focused on, but it didn't come up in conversations when talking about regulations and their activities. And the same goes for internal discussions. It's a very loose finding, maybe something that needs to be dug into more, just because it didn't come out from our kind of line of questioning. Users are not encouraged to use the guidance when carrying out their exemption activity. So there's a sort of focus both in terms of the way that the content is written, the systems are set up, but also later on, sort of mentioned actually previously by Graham, the user's mental model of this process is focused on registration. However, there is no kind of encouragement to come back and reread those conditions when you're actually looking at, how many tons of dredging am I looking at, or how many cubic meters of X am I handling right now or going to handle over the next year. Let's move on, thank you. So the area teams have access to a tool that is location based, and it's a map that's called My Map, and it allows them to see if a site or location is near one of these specific places, like a endangered species site or an SSSI, as mentioned before. This is used within the context of permits and not so much in the context of exemptions. It's not available to users. And it's potentially something that could be useful, maybe the tool itself or the underlying data in some form could enable that decision-making process. Staff learn on the job, and they use the same online exemption content that the users do, which is on gov.uk. So by that, learning on the job, when they're, someone may made a very sensible request, I'm going to break asbestos, or I'm going to handle asbestos, then they know that's permit and they can go straight there. But other requests may be a bit more grey, and that requires them to either use their knowledge, their experience, the team's experience, or to trawl through the conditions and try and find exemptions or other regulatory options that meet that user's activity. Which takes us on to the fact that they try to stay within the 2-hour window to provide free advice, which is part of the pre-application advice service. They've created ways to be time efficient, such as having templates, email templates that they can edit, and other ways to do so. However, because they start with exemptions as a kind of primary place to make sure that there isn't an exemption that meets this activity, which is a cheaper option for users, as they don't need to pay for it, they just need to register it, and they still need to go through this process of looking. And then finally, from me, the customer hub and area teams must help users find and understand information on NRW's website. So there was a lot of conversation with those different teams about how the website at the moment is difficult to find, and users ask to be signposted to specific content. The teams themselves sometimes struggle to find that specific content, and hand-holding sometimes is carried out by people in Customer Hub, actually on the phone with users reading through content. So there is a need to make that experience better. I'm passing over now to Michael.
Hey, thanks, Adam. And yes, I'll now talk about some of the supporting insights we gained around content, some more specific ones compared to the broader insights, that Graham, broader findings rather, that Graham covered. So for the first of these, farmers don't think of their activity as waste related. It turns out a farmer dredging spoil from a river doesn't think of that spoil as waste. It's something you can use. You can either spread it on the shore, make sure that just get it out so that the canal doesn't flood. They could use it in landscaping, get aggregates from it. So it's actually almost the opposite of waste, really. So that's a case of the language that the organization is using, the regulations are using, that doesn't map to the mental model of the user. So that's something we'd want to do with any iteration of the content. For the next of the insights, while staff at NRW might be familiar with the waste codes, most farmers are not remembering these, particularly like the D1 isn't what they think of. They just they need to get waste material. No, sorry, not waste. Organic material and branches, whatever, from the bottom of the canal, so it can be used for later for irrigation, etc. And for the next insight, we know that the content of the guidance on gov.uk from the Environment Agency on the individual exemption activities, it generally does apply to Welsh users. That the reasons to get it off, because there will be particular cases where there's a slightly different need and a lot of other reasons around content maintenance, that sort of thing. But the problem with it is the guidance also on gov.uk includes links to the Environment Agency service, and that is definitely not usable by Welsh users. So at the top of each of those pages, there's a content format that gov.uk uses, and it says applies to England. That's correct in the sense that a lot of the content is derived from the regulation that applies, but it's not visible from the green start button at the bottom, where it's actually more useful to say that, look, this service that we're linking off to does not apply to you if you're in Wales. So that's actually, yeah, it's a really bad user journey, because someone ends up there and they don't really know, does this apply for me? They might get it the wrong way around. So there's more later on what we want to do with that in the recommendations. And then the next insight, we know that that most users come to the pages directly from a search engine like Google's. They don't necessarily start on the register, renew your exemptions page. That's sort of a broad observation on content everywhere, is that the page views are often generated from people coming from a major search engine like Google. So a user might search for burn waste on your farm and end up directly on the D7 exemption page for that activity, and they'll be bypassing all of the important contextual information on the NRW service page, all of the instructions that they need to read. So it's important that when building content to account for organic journeys like that. You can't always, and that's usually something that can be done with using navigational elements on the page, other contextual clues. But again, coming back to that, and again, this would be a recommendation, having the content from gov.uk on exemptions on the NRW website allows that much more easily anyway. And then finally, the last observation, is that the common need of content of this will be about whether someone should register for a particular exemption, and as well as that answer, kind of an onward journey if relevant. The gov.uk waste exemptions content strays away from that and tries to be a little bit too one-stop shop about it, in the sense that there's content particular to related exemptions that appears on that. So in the D1, for example, there's content that essentially is about not littering. That's not the central need. There's a call to action for checking for hazardous waste, which is kind of a step too far. Someone is there to determine if they should register, not to then, kind of foretell the content of what they've dredged. Yeah, so that's something we'll speak about in the recommendations as well, kind of coming out of that. So that's it for the supporting insights for content. And now Thomas is going to talk you through those recommendations.
That's right. Thank you, Michael. Apologies once more for the lightning pace of this, but we do have lots to get through. So our first recommendation is to investigate whether exemptions can be designed better in a way that encourages users to self-regulate. What we mean by that is the focus currently of the waste exemption service and the focus of how users think about it, their mental model, is all about registration. When actually the aim of the regulations are to enable farmers and other users of other exemptions to self-regulate, to make sure that they're always doing the right thing, exhibiting the right behaviours. But actually everything's just focusing on, have I registered? Yes, great. Then I go off and don't think about it anymore. So our concern is, though the content isn't very good on gov.uk, and there's clear benefit that could be gleaned from improving it, if you do that but keep the same focus on the registration and don't try and alter the mental model of NRW thinking of it as a registration, users thinking of it as a registration, rather than an ongoing series of behaviors, then you're not going to see the benefit that you might want to see, or that you would want to see. So we think it's worth investigating how to change that focus and whether that can be done, rather than plowing ahead with a big content audit and a big period of work content design with the same focus as is. There would be benefits from that in you're improving the reputation of the website as a good source for content. Users are going to understand a bit better about what the exemptions are and feel more comfortable in registering the correct ones, and you might get better data out of it and a more accurate register. But those are great, but they're not the key thing of our users exhibiting the right behavior and protecting the environment. So that's why we think that needs a bit more investigation rather than plowing straight ahead into a big content overhaul. So that likely would want to happen at some point down the line, because the content as it is isn't good enough. And as part of that, obvious one, make the exemptions guidance available on the NW website. I believe this has already been agreed to happen as in track. Correct me if I'm wrong. But yeah, it makes sense. It means NW can guide those onward journeys into the correct place. Users aren't being confused by having to go off into a different website to understand things. It's not, saying applies to England only when actually part of it applies to Wales. So bringing that onto the NW website makes total sense. When that's being done, that is a great opportunity to improve the bilingual content processes within NW. Currently, the exemption guidance and that full journey is not available in Welsh. So NW needs to, when it brings it over, make that journey available in Welsh. That's a great opportunity to change the way that is done and to try new opportunities and new ways of doing it. We've, I know the Woodlands Creations team have done some really good work in this area around bilingual content design and pair and trio writing with Welsh and English speakers. So this work is a great opportunity to further that and to think about how that might be done more systematically in the future. We've suggested some principles of how that might be done, making sure that the Welsh speaker is involved from the beginning of the creation of the content, not just at the end, that they understand the users, they understand the needs that are underpinning the content. So when they're writing it, they are more able to write in plain Welsh style rather than quite copying technical language from the English. That needs to be done rather than translating everything directly. It's done in a way that Welsh speakers will understand. Lots of the Welsh speakers we spoke to, both in the Welsh user research sessions that were conducted in Welsh and in the English ones that were conducted in English, but with Welsh speakers, they said that lots of government websites and kind of technical things that were translated into Welsh were very, very difficult for them to understand. And that the Welsh that was used was a kind of like high register Welsh that didn't quite match with their spoken Welsh. So they preferred then to use the English language versions because they felt comfortable with that. Some of them, though they grew up speaking Welsh at home, spoke English at school, so they did all their forms and exams and all of their kind of technical admin stuff in English. So to them, doing it in Welsh was new and different. That's not to say there's not value in fronting Welsh for those people, but there's a challenge to overcome in habits. So lots of thinking needs to be done in how best you change that. Part of it is if you build it, they will come. But part of it is you need to think about how you bring the ones that don't come along with you there. And this is a great opportunity to start doing that and to kind of be a leader across the Welsh public sector in the way Welsh content design is done. A further recommendation is to concentrate on users whose behaviour you want to change. NW has a kind of conceptual model of how it views its users. Some people who are really great at complying and know everything and help other people. Some people who have no interest in complying, and the other end of the spectrum who are never going to be looking at the guidance. So we need to think about who's the guidance for, whose behaviour we're trying to change, and target them a bit more specifically, because you can't cover everything in the guidance. You can't make it say everything that's in the regulations. Otherwise, you might as well just publish the regulations. The regulations are really important, and people need to understand what's in them. The guidance is different to the regulations and has to exist separately, but kind of parallel track, so that users are able to understand the things they need to understand from the regulations. And that means writing the guidance specifically with them in mind, specifically with their understandings in mind, and trying to step away from the organizational the view that NRW has of things and taking it from the view that users have of things. That is so much easier said than done, but it's something that will really help improve comprehension of the guidance and compliance with the conditions. And our final thing here is to improve the registration and renewal journey. Now, I know we didn't look particularly at the registration and renewal journey. We deliberately kept that quite out of scope, but obviously with the focus on registration within the content, it came up again and again in, in our user research interviews. We did do a brief look into it. One of the things we found was that users are not able to amend their registrations, and that they can't, if they want to add a new exemption or remove an existing exemption, they cannot do that via the website. The only way they can currently do that is by phoning up the customer hub, getting them to deregister all of their exemptions, and then re-registering with the added or removed exemption. Generally the user journey isn't particularly user friendly. It takes you onto a portal, which is a different looking part of the website. That's run by a third party, I believe, so it's difficult to amend. So there's lots of improvements that can be made there. We can't say particular detail because we didn't look at it in detail, but it seems obvious that that would be useful activity. Not just for the fact so that they can amend and do the things that enable them to think of activities and not exemptions as an ongoing thing, not just a registration every 3 years, but also it's going to reduce calls to the customer hub. It's going to reduce the burden generally on NRW staff. It should then improve the accuracy and the quality of the public register, and then NRW can then start to use the data that they hold in more useful ways. Lastly, a few more general process learnings from how this project has gone. And just working with the user group that we did, which is farmers. They've been very difficult to research with. All lovely people, all very busy people. So when doing this in the future, and this applies to NRW or any other public sector body that might be interested in farmers, consider some of these things. So having a reliable funnel of participants, so building up a bank of them beforehand that you can start to draw down from during the project, because we had a big gap near the beginning where we couldn't get anyone in. It was quite a long lead up. Thinking about having different sorts of user research and expert panels to talk through some of the common challenges that these user groups face, and also building automatic recruitment into general things that NRW does, whether it's via pop-ups on the website, hey, would you be interested in talking to us? Or little lines in the end of comms saying, if you're interested in hearing more or talking to us about your experiences, then email us and becoming a regular participant. Farmers were very variable in their availability, in that they would say yes Wednesday at 10, and then suddenly a calf has been born or something, so they can't do it last minute. Every single farmer participant that we got rescheduled at least once, which according to a recruitment agency never happened to them before. So it's very busy, tricky people to get hold of. So something to think about. And yet, as well, if user research as a capability in NRW is to expand, it does need to think about how it's going to scale its working practices in terms of holding people's data and using it, and ethical good practice to follow. Just something to bear in mind more than anything else. So that is us. I believe that is 2 minutes to go currently. I know lots of you are going to be very busy and we'll have to shoot off. But if you do have questions, I've got time for questions. I can hang on as long as necessary. But yes, thank you so much for attending all of these show and tells. It's been really great having you all here, and getting feedback from all of them has been really useful and has helped guide and improve our project. I do also want to say big thank you to everyone who's worked with us in all of these, whether it's Geraint and John and James Lewis and Lucinda and everyone else, and everyone on the project team, so Adam and Graham and Michael and Sam and Pete, who's away in Greece, so actually not Pete. Thank you so much for making it a joy to work with you all, and I hope to work with you very, very soon again. If anybody has any questions, please give us a shout now. Simon.
Yeah, well done, and it's a good example as well of how gov.uk content falls short for Welsh users, and also I thought a great example of how you can use service development to build wider sorts of techniques, such as the trio writing. And I know I've talked to Michael a bit about that. I'm just wondering, could you say a little bit about how you gauge the greater understanding on the part of the farmers of the content in the prototype? How did that work?
Yeah, Graham, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. We first of all, a word about the extent. We tested both prototypes with a couple of English speakers and a Welsh speaker. So there was it's kind of small scale, and in the manner that sort of Thomas sort of demonstrated. We had a kind of user-led walkthrough and think aloud protocols, and I suppose we're at the beginning, really, of what the prototypes could teach us. I would say. But it gave us enough to be able to think that we were traveling in the right direction from the information we'd received around sort of lack of comprehension. As I say, our model was mainly around sort of cognitive load and assessing whether, what people, whether there were improvements in what people could understand as a limit, what people could safely ignore, and how better people could relate what they read to their own knowledge practice and ultimately the task they had to produce. And so we were at the beginnings of positive information around that, rather than, as you might imagine, anything conclusive. Does that get at what you were asking, Simon?
Yeah, I think as well, one of the limitations of our understanding there is we did only focus on one exemption, and actually in reality almost everyone registers more than one exemption or exemption activity. So that's a gap in our understanding, is how does that cognitive load work when they've got 3, 4, 5, 6 exemption activities that they want to register? Would that decision tree question flow still work in reducing a cognitive load, or would that take too long? Would that be frustrating for users? So figuring out that bit of it would be next.
Yeah, no, thanks. That's past the slide. Thank you.
Great. Any more questions for anyone? If you think of some later, you can always, of course, email me. There's my email on the screen.
Yeah. I was just going to say how useful I found that, particularly about farmers, because I'm a content developer and I'm working with agriculture and woodlands and other areas that involve farmers. I think that was really useful, the insight into farmers there. It's a few things that I hadn't considered, I hadn't come across. There was one line though, we don't think farmers use websites. So what are they using, and how do we adapt to that?
Just on the kind of user research level, I think we don't think that they don't, if you see what I mean. But we had started out with the assumption that that was at the centre of people's digital expertise as farmers, and we learned that that wasn't the case. So I hope I haven't overemphasised the fact that they didn't use websites at all. But yeah, I think there are several reasons. One is that you could make the website better to use, which is where we concentrated. But there may be other digital routes by which farmers have already become fluent in pursuing what they need, and there might be opportunity there. I thought YouTube was particularly interesting. That came up a couple of times, and it seemed it's a very natural, seemed to be a very natural thing for a farmer to look for a talking head, if you like, to expand their knowledge.
Yeah, and I think another of the limitations of our research is that by nature, everyone we spoke to was comfortable with video calls. So that is a minimum level of self-selecting level of digital expertise that were required to participate. So, you know, it might be that most farmers don't do any digital stuff. But I don't think that's true, but you know, only the ones who have a computer and are comfortable talking on video would speak to us. I remember I sat in one session and the farmer said that he never used any websites at all. He used Microsoft Teams to talk to people and to talk to his family who lived far away, and kind of that was it. Where there's others who were on the internet all the time, read everything online, preferred to do things online, had a side business that was doing translations online. So there's a real mix there. So the main thing was that our assumptions were different to what we found out, I think.
The user that said he didn't use web pages or web content, do you think that's because it's so difficult to find task-focused content? So he's coming. You imagine
it wasn't just in terms of how he interacts with, you know, NRW. It was websites general. You know, not going on Google, not going on BBC, not going on YouTube. Literally not using a web browser.
Okay.
But yeah, I think there's definitely, you know, if you're going to make improvements to the website to try and improve user behavior, you got to think about, are users looking at the website at all? So thinking about how to get those people engaged. Lots of users found out what they were supposed to do via consultants or via unions. Lots of people said they got help from their union, various things. So they're potentially a route to go down when thinking about changing the focus of the guidance, is to make sure that they're engaged with it as well, because they actually might be getting what they know from the website, or sometimes the customer hub who are getting what they know from the website. So somewhere along the line, everyone is getting their information from NRW. That's my fault. My watch went off. So yeah, so changing the website will have a knock-on effect, even with those who aren't engaging with the website, but that will take a lot longer to filter through.
Okay, thank you.
Myra, I think you're next.
Hi, I've really enjoyed the presentation. It's absolutely great and fascinating, and can I encourage you to share the findings as much as possible, please? My question is pretty simple. If you were only able to do a really few things as a consequence of this, what would your top things be?
That's a good question. I think making sure that the content gets brought over to NRW so that in future changes can be made. Putting in Welsh, because that's an obligation that NW has. I think if there wasn't an opportunity to kind of investigate changing the focus, because I think that could be quite a meaty chunk of work, it could do with a content audit of the various exemptions, particularly the most commonly used exemptions, to improve the content as written. That would have an impact. And then also enabling people to add or remove or amend their registrations to add in new exemption activities would be near the top of the list, definitely.
Thank you.
And Judith?
Hello, as a former member of the Customer Hub, when we first did exemptions, it was quite a shock to the system for us and for a lot of the farmers. And one of the overriding findings for me is that even though the farms were registered in the name of the patriarch of the family, it was quite often the mother or a younger member of the family that would deal with the paperwork and have the understanding of that. And I wondered whether that sort of featured in the people that you were interviewing, because if you'd gone to, as I said, the person as the registered owner of the farm, they might not have that interaction, but perhaps their wife would have been far more familiar with it, but maybe not involved. Things may well have changed since I was doing them then, and I think through COVID, people have gotten more used to doing things online. But I wondered whether that was part of the reason for disparities in usage.
I think Graham will be able to add detail on this, but yes, there was definitely people who use consultants to fill in their paperwork for them. And I was on one interview where they filled in their exemption for the farm that they worked on with their father-in-law. It was under the father-in-law's name, but they also helped out their neighbour with their paperwork, so they filled out for them. So then you're also then, if the focus is entirely on registering, you're losing the ability to engage with people who aren't even doing the registering themselves, so they're not engaging with that guidance at all. So they're getting their guidance on how to comply with those conditions via people who are not us. So that is something to think about as well there. Graham, I don't know if there's any more detail on particular participants.
Internal user interviews said exactly what you said, Judith, is that, you know, there's often family members involved, so that the knowledge stays within the, at least within the household. We didn't come across so much of that, really. We only came across references to it. So it was further down in our sort of delivered findings, but also we sort of mentioned consultants and people in unions and things who help as more significant, because they are outside the household, they aren't readily available to the farmer, so they are a distinct, once removed source of exemptions knowledge. But definitely that's been a feature of our consideration, the kind of digitally able family member making things sort of run smoothly. And we, you know, I think if we'd spoken to more people, we would have come across perhaps more of it.
And also I visited the Royal Welsh Show last week, and it seems every farmer in Wales goes there. So I'm thinking that would be an ideal opportunity to target certain events. And you know, the summer agricultural shows that are advertised, it seems, all through the summer. Maybe timings of things would be, you know, it'd be better idea to have a captive audience then, and you might get more engagement at those kind of events to get through to people.
Completely agree. And some of the things that we heard were the successes in explaining exemptions associated with meetings of people at any scale, you know, small and large, but definitely agree with what you say, Judy.
Thank you. It has been very interesting. Much appreciate your efforts.
Thanks. Great. Any other questions? Take that as a no. As always, you can email if you suddenly wake up in the middle of the night and think of a burning question. But otherwise, that's it from us. Thank you so much for coming to these, and thanks again to everyone who helped us with this work. And yeah, have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you very much. Really useful. Thank you.